Oof, 5 months since my last Fate video? Well, that's gotta change. For those who are blind and can't read the title, I'm covering the Shiro vs Gilgamesh fight. If you ask the average Fate fan their opinions on it, they'll say it's hella hype, but if they're asked what else is great about it, their brain stops working. I'm here to change that, as I believe that this fight has tons of care put into it, specifically when you consider two things: the character dynamics between Shiro and Gilgamesh, and the symbolism behind Shiro's Ubi-W. So let's get into it. To start, I'll cover the different ways that Shiro and Gilgamesh contrast with each other. One interesting way they differ has to do with the nature of their goals. On one hand, you have Shiro, who chases an impossible goal. Even if it's impossible though, he still dedicates his whole life to it. On the other hand, you have Gilgamesh. We all know my guy is hella overpowered and can easily attain almost any goal he sets for himself. And yet, because of this, he really lacks motivation to pursue much of anything, which we primarily see in Fate Zero. Even in Fate Stay Night, where we see him have the goal of destroying the entire world, he seems to pursue such a thing half-heartedly. Not only that though, but obviously he views humans as weak mongrels who can't attain any ambitious goal like saving everyone. So in one corner, we have a guy who is seeking an impossible dream with tons of motivation. Then, in the other corner, we have a guy who believes humans can't accomplish any grand dreams, and who himself can't attain any dream he wants, and yet lacks the motivation to do much of anything. Already an interesting contrast established here. But of course, y'all know the biggest contrast between them. Gilgamesh thinks of Shiro as a faker. On the surface level, this refers to how Shiro's weaponry consists of just imitating existing weapons that other people have used. It also refers to how Gilgamesh's weaponry is obviously made up of weapons stored in his treasury, and therefore they can be considered to be his weapons and not imitations. But that's not all. You could say many things about Gilgamesh, but one thing you can't say is that his beliefs are an imitation or a fake, as he came up with them himself. Not only that, but in general, Gilgamesh thinks most idealistic people to be fakers. He believes idealism is just a foolish way for humans to fake the idea that they're honorable and civilized people, when really they're controlled by animalistic desires. That is why he eggs on Kirei to commit just a minuscule magnitude of trolling and not to lie to himself. Of course, he also highly values originality and hates when people imitate anything in general. And that brings us to Shiro. As you know, Shiro has decided to pursue the ideals that Kiritsugu initially had. He did this for a couple reasons. First, he did admire Kiritsugu and wanted to fulfill his wish for his sake. Second, Shiro at the time would have latched onto anything to give his life meaning, and that happened to be the thought of saving someone just like when Kiritsugu saved him. Finally, Shiro did believe that such an ideal was noble. But the point is, without ever meeting Kiritsugu, Shiro would have never taken on those ideals, so that's why he's a fake. Without Kiritsugu, he never would have desired such an ideal. Or at least, that's what I first thought, but there's actually even more to delve into. I might start interpreting Shiro's character wrong, so feel free to correct me in the comments. See, Shiro doesn't want to save people. He wants the happiness he gets from saving others. That is because Shiro saw how happy Kiritsugu felt when saving him, so now Shiro is chasing after that very same happiness by trying to save others himself. Basically, Shiro is quite selfish. He doesn't want to inherently save others, he wants the happiness he'd gain by saving others. This is another reason why Shiro is considered a faker. He's faking the idea that he's selflessly chasing this ideal, when really he's doing it for himself. That was a long explanation, but I felt it was really needed to understand why specifically Shiro is a faker. Anyways, I talked about these differences because it gives the fight a lot more meaning, because you can see that the fight doesn't happen without reason, and you get to see the differences in ideals bounce off each other during the fight. It's not just that, however. Shiro also proves Gilgamesh's side wrong regarding both perspectives. First, let's talk about the first contrast, attainability versus unattainability. Shiro does realize Gilgamesh is right, there's no way he could logically save the world. Even so, Shiro's still going to damn well try. No, actually, he's going to believe that he can save everyone, that he can make the impossible possible. It may sound incredibly stupid for him to believe that he can do such an impossible thing, but hey, that's how Shiro works. Not only that, but the fact that his dream's impossible makes it all the more important that he defeats Gilgamesh in this fight. See, Shiro defeating Gilgamesh and saving the world seems like it would be impossible, right? So, if Shiro actually accomplishes an impossible task like this, then he may be able to save everyone one day. And of course, he does beat Gilgamesh, proving if he can do one seemingly impossible thing like beating the strongest servant in the game, then doing another impossible task like saving everyone should be a piece of cake. Now, let's talk about the second contrast, the idea of fake versus real. So Gilgamesh thinks Shiro is a fake who didn't even come up with his own ideals, doesn't even want to really save others, and is using this ideal to mask his inner darkness. How does Shiro respond? With the average Twitter response, okay and? I think here, Shiro does acknowledge that he was trying to be like Kiritsugu, and does realize that he is saving others to make himself feel better. However, he realizes that such a fact doesn't even matter. After all, even if he is only doing it for himself, saving others cannot be something that's wrong to do. To Shiro, doing such a selfless thing for a selfish reason is completely fine, because at the end of the day, other people still benefit from the selfless act. His answer to Gilgamesh is embodied in this line: "There's no rule that an imitation cannot defeat the original." Of course, on the surface, this refers to how Shiro can defeat Gilgamesh's Gate of Babylon with his fake weapons and UBW. However, it also refers to two other things. First, Shiro says that even if he was only imitating Kiritsugu's dream, that doesn't matter in the slightest. He's going to try to surpass Kiritsugu by trying to accomplish what Kiritsugu couldn't, saving everyone. This quote is also Shiro's way of saying that even if he is only helping others to make himself feel better, he can still do just as much good as someone who truly desired to save others. So really, this fight is great in how Gilgamesh and Shiro are pretty great foils to each other. Furthermore, it's where Shiro basically completes the development he started in the Shiro vs Archer fight. There, Shiro had realized he was a fake who didn't really want to save people, but it's in this fight right here where he fully accepts that part of him. Now, I'm gonna go over some details that adds to Shiro's character, which are only present specifically in this fight. I might sound too much like your English teacher analyzing this fight though, so be ready. First, there are actually differences in the UBW chants of Shiro and Archer, which reveal a lot about their mentality. This is Archer's chant, and this is Shiro's chant. Some of the lines are the same, like
Health withstood pain to create many weapons.
This one refers to how Shiro and Archer both have sacrificed a lot to create weapons, and in this case I think creating weapons means saving other people. However, the chants diverge in the later lines, and there's one line in particular that best highlights the change in their mentalities. For Archer, the second to last line is,
Yet, those hands will never hold anything.
This refers to how Archer thinks he will never find happiness in life, because he is now trapped in the cycle of being a counter guardian. However, for Shiro, the second to last line is now,
I have no regrets. This is our only path.
While Archer's line seems to imply regret over chasing this ideal,
No, wait.
Shiro is saying, screw it, we still ballin'. There's also a lot of symbolism with what the world of UBW represents to Shiro. My interpretation is that the world of Unlimited Blade Works represents Shiro's impossible ideal. That is because, as I mentioned a bit before, Shiro compares saving others to creating swords in his UBW chant. So, if saving one person equals creating one sword, then a world of infinite swords represents an ideal world where everyone is saved. Now that we established that the reality marble represents an ideal world, we can compare the differences in Shiro and Archer's worlds. First, we see that Archer's world is a lot more turbulent and darker. This reflects how Archer feels about his ideal, believing that his ideal was futile and that he never should have pursued it. Meanwhile, Shiro's is actually half dark and half light, which was actually pointed out to me in a YouTube comment. The darker side of this world symbolizes how Shiro does realize that his ideal will likely lead to suffering, and that he doesn't really value saving people inherently. However, the light side is symbolized by how Shiro still feels that the ideal is worth pursuing because even if he doesn't want to save people, he can still understand how beautiful it would be. One more thing, you might notice that Archer's world has gears while Shiro's doesn't. Another comment on one of my posts explains it pretty well. Archer views himself as a cog who is trapped without any will, but of course Shiro in the meantime is chilling. Another interesting thing is that the reality marble is compared to having everything and nothing at the same time. This refers to how every sword can be found in UBW, yet at the same time no real sword can be found there because all of the swords are just imitations and fakes. But once again, there's more to unpack. It also represents how, first, the ideal of saving everyone is everywhere in Shiro's heart, because he of course dedicates his whole life to saving others. Second, it also represents how the ideal of saving everyone is nowhere in Shiro's heart, because as I mentioned before, Shiro only saves others because it makes himself happy. Now, that's some pretty cool symbolism that's found only in this fight, though I have no idea if any of this was the author's intention or if I'm just reading way too hard into this. Anyways, that's the video. It was really the hardest video for me to script. It legit took me 3 weeks. However, I feel like at least now I have a much better understanding of Shiro's character and this fight, and it honestly puts my first video to shame at this point. Hopefully y'all were able to gain a greater appreciation for the fight from this video, and have a good day. Next video though, get ready for